Hi, this is Jim Isleib with Michigan State University Extension. I'm a crop production educator in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. We'll be talking for a short while about small fruits for the UP gardener. My contact information is on this screen, so feel free to contact me. This recording is produced on behalf of the Beta Knot Gardening Conference, which had to be canceled last year and again this year in 2021. You can find out about upcoming conferences and programs from the Beta Knot Gardening Club by visiting their website. That link is listed here, and all internet links that I list are not going to be live. They're not going to be hot links on this recording. So you'd have to stop the recording and write them down. What is this video? It contains a quick look at a few small fruit options that can work well in the UP. Not at all intended to be comprehensive, just a few things that I think are good ones. A few pointers on growing these suggested fruits successfully based on my own personal experiences, my observation of gardeners around the UP, and information from MSU Extension. And there's also some online resources from MSU included. Some considerations for you as you think about growing small fruits. I just want fresh fruit. Do you want enough so you can do some canning and cooking with it? Just one type of small fruit or more? Are you the type of person that likes to experiment with unusual fruits or different varieties? What is your production philosophy? Organic production of small fruits is more challenging, takes more attention to detail, and you have to seek out and use organic inputs. Conventional production is easier, simpler, but it's not organic. So you have to, that's your decision. Whatever approach you use, you want to use good pest management practices. IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management. And also think about your assets. Do you have enough space? Should you be growing your small fruits in containers? How much work can you afford to put into this? How much money? And kind of a big one is how much pressure are you going to have from wildlife and from other people? So think about those things. We're going to talk about strawberries, raspberries, both summer and fall bearing types, Hearty blueberries, and some others. I'm going to not say too much about these others, grapes, currants, etc., but I do think that they deserve a mention. And I also want to give you a heads up about the spotted wing Drosophila, which is a relatively new pest in soft-bodied fruits, including all of our small fruits. Your small fruit site for all types needs acceptable soils, good drainage, and appropriate pH. It should be well drained. Loam or loamy sand would be best. Blueberries are different. They need a particularly acidic soil. It's got to be very acidic. It's pH of 4.5 to 5 or 5.5, well drained, high organic matter, and a high water table is desirable. You can get by without that. You want to avoid very coarse, sandy, droughty soils and avoid soils that have a perched water table, that have hard pans underneath, or are poorly drained clays. You want to have the right soil pH, and this little chart shows that all small fruits are not the same. The strawberries, raspberries, Saskatoons, they're more like your vegetable garden or kind of a typical 6.5, 6.8 soil pH. Grapes a little lower, and blueberries a lot lower. Your site needs good sun exposure. Full sun is always best. You want to be aware of temperature fluctuations. Avoid low spots where frost settles. The frost-free period is very important, and good access to water. As far as temperature, brambles and the brambles including raspberries, blackberries, those are more sensitive. Blueberries are more sensitive, and grapes are very sensitive to low temperatures. So you always want to be careful about getting the hardiest varieties. Strawberries and Saskatoons are more forgiving. All of them need plenty of water. Let's talk about strawberries. We have two main types, June bearing versus everbearing. The June bearing ones, the picking period is compressed into a few weeks. They're generally more productive. And those are the ones that I'm highest on, is the June bearing types. You want to pick a good variety and also buy your plants from a reputable source. It's always tempting to get them shared from a friend or neighbor, and you could do that, but you have a much higher risk of importing all the problems that your neighbor has developed in their strawberry patch over the last several years. So get them from a good virus-free, disease-free source. Select a good site, amend the soil before you start, or prepare your planters if you're going to grow them in some other way than in a garden soil. Set your plants out properly, follow a good planting pattern. The matted row is probably the most typical one, and the resources that I'm going to refer you to will go into detail. We don't really have time for that right now. Strawberries are very prone to damage from frost when they're flowering early in the spring. You can cover them to protect them from that. Commercial growers spray them with water. They irrigate them when there's a freeze predicted. But nevertheless, you want to have a good watering plan and a good watering system. Keep your strawberries weed-free, especially the first year, but right from year to year. When you're establishing your new strawberry planting, pick all the flowers off. Don't let it make any fruit the first year. If you do, they won't spread and form new daughter plants as vigorously. You want to fertilize properly. The fertilization program is much more aggressive the first year because you're encouraging plant development, lots of new plants, and you're not worried about fruit. These plantlets develop on stolons, long stems that grow out of the mother plant, and you can move them around so that they're spaced out as well as you can while they're developing that first year. You can mulch your strawberries with straw for the winter. If you're in heavy snow country like I am here in Munising, Michigan, that snow provides a good mulch for weather protection. The mulch serves another purpose though. When spring comes and the plants start to grow, you can move that mulch between the rows, and then your plants will be forming strawberries on that mulch, not on the soil surface. And you can reduce fruit rots that way. When growth resumes in the spring after your establishment year, that's when you would move your mulch aside. Don't fertilize your strawberries in the spring. This is a key thing. If you give them nitrogen fertilizer in the spring, it will result in lower quality soft berries. You want to keep your strawberry beds watered consistently and be prepared to cover them in case of frost during the flowering period. As the berries develop and ripen, watch out for rodents, watch out for other pests. Rodents can really be a problem, especially in a real small patch with lots of cover for wildlife around it. You may need to put out some traps. You may need to cover your patch with mesh or row cover or something. Once the fruits start to ripen, you'll be picking your berries every other day. When the harvest is complete, that's when you would want to mow off your plants. This is kind of a funny thought for some people, but it's very effective in keeping your strawberry patch going for several years. You want to mow off the old foliage. That gets rid of diseases that are taking hold in your strawberry plants. Set your mower high enough so that you're not damaging the crowns of the plants. That's the time when you fertilize. After your harvest is all done, mow off your patch, then you put fertilizer on. And the resources I'm providing will give you some ideas about fertilizing. If you're an organic fertilizer, that's when you would top dress with your compost or whatever. If enough new plants are rooted, you can create new rows and alleys by removing the old plants. Just till right through your old row and use those new plants to start up your new row. Or you may just want to thin out your existing rows. In following years after establishment and the second year, keep that patch well weeded, keep it well watered. Always fertilize after harvest, as I mentioned. Watch out for frost. control rodents and pests, mulch it if needed or preferred. Renovate, that mowing, fertilizing, weeding, that's an annual process. If you want your strawberry patch to last more than a few years, that's what you really need to do. And you can move those new daughter plants around as needed. Here are some resources for variety selection. There's lots of good varieties. You want to pick ones that are proven in the area, and these are listed off in this material. There's a good publication from University of Minnesota Extension. I have found that Minnesota has some really great small fruit resources, and there's several of them listed in this presentation. Also from New Hampshire, I figure that's pretty close to our environment also. So there's a couple good resources that have a lot more detail. And when you're buying strawberry plants, you want to be sure and get them from a good, reputable place, a local garden center, or you can get them from a garden catalog. I've got one indicated here. I'm not recommending it above the others, but it is a good one. And they have lots of information and a large selection of all kinds of small fruits. That's the Indiana Berry Company. Here's a couple photos from one of my former strawberry patches. I just started a new one this year. And this was not a very productive strawberry planting. And the biggest problem was that it was planted right next to a row of peonies, which got real big and bushy and shaded the strawberries too much. I didn't really have enough space here. It's kind of crowded into my vegetable garden. I did get some strawberries. The biggest problem I had was with mice and chipmunks. They just ate all the berries, regardless of how much I tried to trap them. So this new planting that I just started last year, I have a scheme that I'm going to cover once the flowering is done and the fruit is set. I'm going to cover that new row of strawberries with some floating row cover and see if that doesn't keep the mice and rodents out of it until the berries are pickable. And then I'll take that off, pick berries, and take it off once the harvest is done. Now we're going to talk a little about raspberries. There's two main types of raspberries. There's summer-bearing raspberries and fall-bearing raspberries. The most common types of raspberries are red. There are other colors, blacks, purples, and yellows. The reds are typically the most vigorous and the people have the most success with them. A black raspberry is not the same as a blackberry. It has raspberry flavor. They don't sucker as much. They don't produce as many new canes. The colored ones are not my favorites personally. You may like them. You may want to try them. Variety selection in raspberries is very important. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And the establishment year is critical. You can't expect raspberries the first year. You're going to be planting probably bare root plants. They're pretty wimpy. You want to space them out properly. I'll let you read the details in the resource material, but it's important to space them out. I think it's quite important to put up a trellis. It can be very simple. It could be a single wire, but it ought to be sturdy, and you need to be able to keep your raspberries from flopping over. I like to tie mine right to the wires so they're nice and sturdy. Again, I'm in heavy snow country, keeps them from being broken down from snow. But I think a trellis really improves raspberry performance. And they are hard to keep weed free, but they do need attention, and you ought to try to keep them weeded. It takes about, in my experience, about 3 years from the time you plant your raspberries until you get a full crop. You'll get some berries the second crop, but they really start to come in after about 3 years. I'm suggesting that you stick with the reds. Always buy virus-free plants. It is, again, tempting to borrow them or take them from a neighbor or friend from their patch. But even more important with raspberries and strawberries, you want to get virus-free plants. I suggest that you try a patch of summer berries and a patch of fall berries planted separately if you're a raspberry lover. And go with the hardiest summer varieties. Boyne is a real good one. Latham is an older one, smaller berries, but extremely cold hardy. It won't get killed by Upper Peninsula weather. Neither will Boyne. And if you're going to plant some fall berries, look for the earliest maturing varieties. The first one that really hit the market big was Heritage, and the canes were hardy, but the fruit did not ripen in time. I've had real good luck with a variety called Autumn Bliss. There are other ones since I planted mine that are, I understand, even better, but I've had good luck with Autumn Bliss. For the summer berries, remove those old canes after they're done fruiting and get rid of them, and tie your new summer canes up to the trellis in the fall time. For your fall bearing plants, cut those canes right down to the ground once they're done bearing. And they have a long drawn out picking period. But once you're done, cut them right down and get them out of there. You'll want to scout and control for spotted wing Drosophila, more about that at the end. And go light on fertilizer with raspberries. Don't over fertilize your raspberries. They like to be mulched. They love being mulched. They like a little fertilizer, but not too much. They need to be kept well watered. Here's some photos of my summer bearing raspberries. It's a combination of Latham and a couple other varieties. And I get real good yields out of this. It's about 20 feet long. You can see the type of trellis I have. I think I have 4 wires stretched across those 2 posts. And in the winter, they do just fine. These are my fall-bearing raspberries. You can see on May 29th, they're just growing up. They were cut right down to the ground the previous fall. And I just have a few pictures to show what they look like as the season goes along. I get the first berries at the end of August, and I continue to pick them right through October. And I like to leave a few until November 12th on my birthday to pick, and then I have bragging rights. I can tell my friends, I picked raspberries today on my birthday. This is what my raspberry patches look like in the winter. There's nothing sticking above the snow in the fall berries, and the summer-bearing raspberries are tied up on trellises. I love growing raspberries, but mostly I love eating them. I love them fresh. I love them made into jam. I love them baked into baked goods. Some of my people love them in smoothies. They're just such a tasty and versatile fruit. And here are some growing resources, again, from Minnesota, and a couple good ones from Michigan, raspberry variety choices, and a real nice article from a Genesee County Master Gardener newsletter on growing raspberries successfully. My third main small fruit crop is Hearty Blueberries. As I mentioned, soil pH is critically important for blueberries. I think the most common mistake is people are trying to grow blueberries in higher soil pHs and they just won't do well. So you have to prepare a site that isn't like this to start with, very aggressively, using pine needles, using sphagnum moss, using an acidifying fertilizer that just won't get it done. You've got to really use elemental sulfur a year ahead of time. If you don't have a year to wait, you can use aluminum or iron sulfate. You have to use 7 times as much of it as elemental sulfur. And we're only talking about a few pounds of sulfur in 100 square feet. So it's available at local garden centers, and usually you can find aluminum or iron sulfate there too. And one of the resources I have will give you details on how much to use. If you're planting blueberries on a site where wild blueberries have been growing, you should be okay. I do suggest the hybrid type blueberries. They're a cross between our native wild blueberries and the domestic high bush. They make big berries and lots of them. They don't get very tall. They're much bigger than the wild ones. But the high bush varieties are risky in our climate. And these half highs, so-called, are extremely cold hardy. They won't get killed. They were developed mostly in Minnesota, and they do real nicely. A few tips on blueberry production. Don't cut corners on site preparation. You'll be disappointed if you do. Blueberries don't tolerate competition. You need to keep weeds out of them and keep them well watered. They don't need to be pruned very much until they've got 6 or 8 years old. And then you want to follow a very moderate pruning program after that. You get a good crop after 3 or 4 years. Let me warn you that rabbits and Other rodents and deer just love blueberries. And I know that from experience, sad experience. So you want to put up some fencing if that becomes a problem or is a problem. Blueberries are real attractive to bumblebees. If you don't have any honeybees around, you'll probably get plenty of good pollination from bumblebees. They're an attractive plant. They have nice color in the fall. One thing about them is that they're hard to grow organically. If you compost them heavily, that will tend to raise the soil pH. So you're fighting against yourself. Can be done, but you want to be careful to maintain that low soil pH. Blueberry roots are shallow and fragile. Don't cultivate too deeply. They'll also be badly damaged if you over-fertilize too close to the plant. So be careful with chemical fertilizers. And do top dress with some elemental sulfur or other soil acidifying product as needed every few years. You got to maintain that low soil pH. Those are my blueberries at home. I have 5 plants. I've had them in the ground for 30 years, and they're very productive. This is what they look like. They have pretty flowers, pretty bell-shaped white flowers in the spring, full of bumblebees. And then by the end of July, I'm in full picking, and that picking period lasts pretty much for a month. And they're just so nice. They're so delicious, and they are big. People say they're not as flavorful as wild blueberries. And that is probably true because the flavor is found right underneath the skin, and the wild blueberries have more skin per ounce of berry than big ones do. But nevertheless, these are real nice, very productive, very convenient for me to pick. And here's what a rabbit infestation can do to them. The fruit is born on 1-year-old cane wood at the tips of the canes, and that's what the rabbits eat. So they ate off all my new wood a couple years ago, just left me with these stubbly little blueberry plants. It didn't kill the plants. As a matter of fact, they grew back like gangbusters, but I had no fruit that year. And I put up a chicken wire fence around my blueberries, which makes them a little less convenient to deal with, but I don't mind. I love those berries, and it's kept the rabbits out of them perfectly for 2 years now. Here's some blueberry growing resources. Hearty cultivars from Minnesota, growing blueberries in the home garden from Minnesota, and a good article from our fruit educator, Mark Longstroth, about lowering soil pH with sulfur. Remember, you'd have to use about 7 times as much aluminum or iron sulfate as you would sulfur, but it reacts quicker. A few other crops that I want to talk about, but I'm not particularly recommending. They'd be fun to try. Grapes, currants, and blackberries. For grapes, we got table grapes, wine grapes, grapes that are grown just for decorative vines and stuff. Key points is they need a lot of heat units to make good, ripe, sweet grapes. And in a lot of places in the Upper Peninsula, we don't have that. But we do have some vineyards and wineries. Those are mostly wine grapes, not sweet table grapes. Currants or gooseberries, which are closely related, they're a very doable crop in our region. However, they are an alternate host for white pine blister rust, and therefore the State Department of Agriculture has limits on what you can plant, and you have to have a permit to plant them legally. So currants are great for jams and juicing and so forth, but be aware that they are restricted in our area. Blackberries. Blackberries are a great crop. They are not as hardy as raspberries. And we have 2 types, really, the thorny or upright versus the thornless. And the thornless are very winter tender. You have to grow them on a trellis and then take them off the trellis, pin them down, and let them get covered with snow. Just a few comments about grapes. I have 1 grapevine at home. I grow it on the same trellis as my thornless blackberries, which I also have. The one that I've had the best success with is the Somerset seedless. There are others. And I get several clusters of little bitty grapes, but they're sweet and they're a lot of fun. And again, it gives you a little bit of bragging rights. Here's our currants. And I do have the link here for the Michigan Department of Agriculture guidelines for which varieties you can grow and who needs a permit. And unfortunately, anybody in the Upper Peninsula needs a permit. But currants aren't hard to grow. There's 3 different main types: whites, reds and blacks. And here's a upright thorny blackberry that I put in a few years ago. I looked for one that was more hardy. I settled on one from Stark Brothers, Primark 45. The canes are very hardy, but they die off in the winter, and I haven't seemed like I haven't had enough of a growing season to get ripe berries yet. But I'm going to keep trying. And these are my thornless or trailing blackberries. You can see how I pin them down with concrete blocks. I just pick, I take all of the new canes. The old canes get cut out like raspberry canes after fruiting. And then I pin them down with cinder blocks or concrete blocks. And then once springtime comes, I take the blocks off and I tie them up onto a trellis and let them go. And they make long, vigorous canes every year. And I don't get a nice crop every year. It depends on how nice of a summer and fall we have. But every 2 or 3 years, I get a nice crop of blackberries, and we really enjoy those. A couple other things to mention, Saskatoons and Haskaps. Both of these are North American native plants. Saskatoons are referred to around here as sugar plums. They grow wild in the woods, but you can buy improved varieties. There's a large industry has been established in Canada where they grow Saskatoons and make them into jams, jellies, and other products. They're very cold hardy. They're very productive. You could consider them sort of a blueberry substitute. They don't need special soil, don't need low pH, don't need anything particularly special. So they're more forgiving. And Haskaps, also called honeyberries, they are another interesting shrubby type small fruit. They ripen very early, so that makes them kind of unique. They're not proven widely in the UP, but they are promising. Here's a picture of Haskaps and Saskatoons and a little bit of detail if you're interested. I did put both of these plants in my own place in Munising. This will be the 3rd year. So I think this was the first year I put them in. I did put up some protection after having that nightmare with the rabbits. I didn't want them eating my new plantings. So we'll see how they do. This is a real good bulletin on unusual fruit plants. If you like the oddball fruits, you ought to download this publication and take a look. And there's a good article about consideration for growing backyard small fruits from my retired colleague, Duke Elsner. I want to spend a minute warning you about the spotted-winged Drosophila. It's a small fruit fly. It's relatively new in the area. They don't wait for fruit to ripen before they lay their eggs in it. They lay their eggs before the fruit is ripe so that the maggots are tunneling around and ruining your fruit when it should be prime fruit. You want to scout and control this pest. It's not real easy to control, but it can be done. The numbers can be reduced. And some of your practices can help. You pick your fruit a little earlier than you would normally. But be aware that this thing is out there. And here are some resources that you could review to educate yourself about the spotted-winged Drosophila. And I want to wish everybody happy gardening in 2021. I love growing small fruits, tree fruits, vegetables, ornamentals. I'm a plant nut, so but small fruits is one of my favorite things, and I hope that this little presentation will encourage you to try some things also.